Tonight, we are pulling back the curtain on fundamental forces that have warped the Western economy. Our guest is Sam Cooper, an award-winning author of the explosive book Willful Blindness. The book reads like fiction, but it's not fiction at all. It's the actual reality for places like Canada and the United States.
Canadian bank lending is also supported by completely falsified and fake mortgage incomes. I estimated strongly that about $1 trillion in this Vancouver model underground banking has washed into Vancouver and Toronto in the past decade. I can establish with 100% confidence that that case is a major irritant between President Trump's White House and the Canadian government.
Where are all the narco traffickers going to keep bringing this stuff into the country? The northern border. And they're sailing around to Vancouver and coming in by air.
Thank you so much for coming on my show, Sam. It's an honor to have you here. Just from a high level, people who aren't familiar with your work, could you just kind of briefly give them an overview and also explain what the Vancouver model is?
Sure. I mean, it's great to be with you. And the Vancouver model really stemmed out of my reporting on the long story is as a newspaper reporter in Vancouver, starting around 2010 and even a little bit earlier. I just took it upon myself to really dig into real estate prices in that city. And part of it was personal motivation. As you know, being a young family man, I saw that my generation was very much priced out of that city. And yet there were really no legitimate high incomes on a sort of an average basis to support just multi-million-dollar properties. Something very wacky was going on. So I discovered that something called Chinese underground banking, which is the way that Chinese organized crime, often working together with Chinese state-adjacent sort of corporate entities, moves cash underground around the world. And Vancouver is an absolute global node of that activity, where my reporting eventually led to anti-money laundering inquiries that found that, you know, money in the order of over $1 billion in cash was laundered through British Columbia government casinos in 1 year. So essentially the Vancouver model is how Chinese underground banks, which are connected to these sort of very 100-year-old secret crime societies called triads, basically make deals with wealthy people from China that want to travel to nice cities around the world. When they land there, they can meet with the gangster who gives them, you know, a suitcase full of cash, quite literally. And, you know, this can be laundered in certain cities such as Vancouver very easily by walking that cash into a casino. And what happens is either that traveler from China has put down a deposit with a bank, let's say in Guangzhou. It's a bank account owned by a fentanyl trafficker. So they've put down a credit. And when they arrive in Vancouver, essentially they're getting paid out with fentanyl cash that's collected from drug sales. So that, you know, it's memorably being described as a dirty money loop between Chinese, you know, fentanyl factories and how fentanyl is dealt in other cities around the world. And these Chinese gangsters collect the cash, lend it out. That's just one step. You know, it gets into real estate, corporations, law offices, supercars, but that's the Vancouver model in a nutshell.
Thank you. And do you think that's partly the reason then that there's such a major discrepancy between home prices and like the median income? Because when you look at like Vancouver or Toronto as an example, it's completely wild. Like the average home price over $1 million and like the median income often below $100,000, which is completely insane.
That's absolutely right. And, you know, that was part of my early motivation as an investigative reporter, was trying to discover where is that disparity coming from? Because already very openly in Vancouver, it was being called, you know, a resort for the global rich or a resort town for China's elites. This was just very well understood. And yet, you know, quite controversial for reporters to say it because, you know, real estate was the number one business in town. But you're absolutely right. You know, the average family median income at the time I was really looking at it, let's say over 10 years ago, was about $80,000 per family Canadian. And yet these homes were even very modest, almost shack-like homes were $2-3 million, right? Up to 15 million, 30 million in the wealthy areas. So it was my work that established bit by bit that the Vancouver model, the casino money laundering, the laundering of funds underground to get the wealthy Chinese visitor and investor paid out in Vancouver without legitimately transferring funds from China, which has a capital controls, right? So my work filled in that gap of where was the liquidity, let's call it, behind those home prices coming from. And I'll tell you, I had to piece a few dots together a decade ago, but in more recent years, I've established that Canadian bank lending is also supported by completely falsified and fake mortgage incomes, again, related to the same wealthy Chinese investors in cities such as Toronto and Vancouver. I think I've established are getting paid out in scale with Canadian bank lending that is very fraudulent. And so I'll give you one sort of data point, piecing together a bunch of stories that would take me hours to recount, including a leak from a banker that helped me establish these fake mortgages. I estimated strongly that about $1 trillion in this Vancouver model underground banking has washed into Vancouver and Toronto in the past decade. So I do think that's got a very material impact on the prices of homes that almost no young Canadian can afford in these cities.
Yeah, and does that give like some real exposure then to average working people, who've seen their home value absolutely explode? Obviously, if it's put these prices up, do you think there's a real risk as well that it could also bring this down if China was to clamp down on it or something was to happen?
That's a great question. It's one I've thought about for over a decade. My answer is from time to time, we do see, I think, that the Chinese underground Vancouver model banking or financial system, which as we now know, has been tied to the TD banking, something like a $3 billion deferred prosecution agreement in the United States, where, as I say, real investigative police agencies were able to establish that this very same sort of bags of cash coming into bank tellers was being used in Canadian banks. And it's tied to these mortgages I'm talking about. Yeah, it's a tremendously complex question because from time to time, when the Chinese real estate market falls, as it has in recent years, in cities like Shanghai, I do think we see, a related slowdown in Vancouver real estate. And we've seen that for the past few years. And yet I just think that the underground banking system is so complex and so interrelated at times with Chinese Communist Party state activity that no one could ever predict that it would be shut off. It's just so embedded into both the mainland China sort of economy and culture. Worldwide, it's a huge, huge system, which is tied also to their Belt and Road projects that I've come to the opinion, I think it would take a war between the United States and China to actually see drop in the liquidity coming from China into places like Canada. It's that established.
Wow, that is really, really interesting. And you mentioned about TD Bank and obviously what happened there. They got fined by the Department of Justice, and I'm not sure if they settled. You probably know more about that case than I do. But how come TD Bank is getting fined in the United States and maybe they're getting a slap on the wrist in Canada? Like, what is going on there, do you think?
That's another brilliant question. And I can tell you, I can establish with 100% confidence that case is a major irritant between President Trump's White House and the Canadian government. I've been told both by senior American government official and a senior Canadian government official that it's been expressed from Washington to Ottawa that they had a big concern that in Canada, as you say, there was essentially no action against TD Bank. I've reported on a major FinTrack report that essentially sort of detailed how this underground banking system evolved during the COVID pandemic when casinos in British Columbia, where I've reported on, were shut down. It evolved into banking. And so what I'm saying is FinTrack knew very well that the TD sort of money laundering system was occurring in all Canadian banks, but all they did was slap something like an $8 million fine on TD. No criminal investigations. And it took the US DEA and Department of Justice to get that it is an agreement, a $3 billion fine for TD admitting there was wrongdoing. And by the way, the case established that their senior management was ignoring suspicious transaction reporting. And effectively, that means they knew money laundering was happening. So I was told again by senior officials in Canada and the United States that this is central to the US government's concerns or allegations that Canada isn't cracking down on fentanyl because it's the financial system that's needed to abet this sort of fentanyl trade.
Yeah, and let's get into that because I was going to ask that question later on. But do you really think there's actually more substance? Because obviously when it blew up and President Trump was saying he's slapping Canada with these tariffs and it's due to the fentanyl trade.
Canada, very much so. They've allowed millions and millions of people to come into our country that shouldn't be here. They could have stopped them, and they didn't. And they've killed 300,000 people last year, my opinion, have been destroyed by drugs, by fentanyl. The fentanyl coming through Canada is massive. The fentanyl coming through Mexico is massive.
All these stories suddenly surface that, it was less than 1%. Do you really think that's true? Or do you think that it's now moving from Mexico? They've realized that it's too difficult now to get the drugs up from Mexico. And now Canada is becoming a better way for that.
I absolutely do think that's true. And I think I've been part of, or I've been apart from Canadian media in my reporting, because as my book sort of established, I had already reported that Vancouver was an extremely important global center for China's fentanyl trafficking. And so
this video was powered by ExpressVPN, helping you protect your privacy with the world's fastest VPN and the VPN that I use. If you want to take advantage of my special offer, go to expressvpn.com/marketmania. Let's get back to it.
For China's fentanyl trafficking. And so you're right. In the early reaction to President Trump's, let's call them sort of instigating comments that Ottawa wasn't taking fentanyl seriously, there were a bunch of reports that I sort of believe came out of the Prime Minister's office saying this is a false allegation. It's only 1%. But if you'll recall, the FBI director, Kash Patel, came out in, I believe it was June. He went on the Joe Rogan podcast and said exactly what you framed there. The Mexican cartels, along with the Chinese Communist Party, after the US government has cracked down on the southern border, Mexico and the United States.
But you know who has to get to step in is Canada. Because they're making it up there and shipping it down here. And I don't care about getting into this debate about making someone the 51st state or not. But they are our partner in the north. And say what you want about Mexico, but they helped us seal the southern border.
Have started to move more fentanyl precursors and product up through the port of Vancouver and British Columbia. And this aligned with sort of all my previous and ongoing knowledge of how Western Canada has these what are called fentanyl super labs, and fentanyl precursor materials from China have been washing in at scale for years. I've been able to document that. So that fit with what Kash Patel had sort of vaguely alleged. And again, his remarks were ridiculed in Canada. But just about a week or two ago, Canada's government finally disclosed that a shipment from China of, I believe, the second largest fentanyl precursor shipment ever came into Vancouver's port. This was seized in May. It was only announced, weeks ago. And the figure of exactly how large it is isn't in my mind right now, but it was enough to produce, I believe, over 1 billion doses of fentanyl. So again, that there had been a previous delivery, which was even larger than that back in 2020, which I point to. And I established a week ago that the US government officials, prior to Kash Patel's interview with Joe Rogan, did know about that undisclosed seizure in Vancouver's port. So I think I can point to a lot of data points showing just the scale of chemicals from China coming into Canada is massive, and it's far beyond Canada's sort of domestic bad problem with fentanyl overdoses. But, it's going somewhere, and I say it's going to the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. I'll give you one more point. I mean, Derek Maltz, the former director of the DEA, spoke to me in exclusive interviews, and he said, yes, weeks, about a couple months after President Trump's crackdown on the southern border, fentanyl seizures were down 50%, and Derek Maltz said, we believe that's going up to Canada. And so I think that's true.
And are the fentanyl seizures now happening in Canada since President Trump got in office and since Ottawa announced that it was going to try and step things up at the border? Are the seizures actually going up a massive amount, or have they not really changed that much?
On an anecdotal basis, I've reported on numerous, fentanyl lab busts within, let's say, the past 6 months. And to me, they very obviously coincide with President Trump's very public pressure, rhetoric, and his tariffs upon Canada. So it raises the natural question. The RCMP either knew, or as my sources on both sides of the border say, was informed by American intelligence of various fentanyl super labs in Quebec, Alberta, British Columbia mostly, Ontario as well. And so the American government complaint is Canada wasn't acting on them. And if you look at the number of lab busts or seizures occurring in Canada in the past year, obviously it's gone up, and public knowledge is starting to go up that we do have a problem in Canada. So I think those things, President Trump's threats, pressure on Canada, and the related seizures that have happened since are very clearly related.
And these precursor chemicals that are coming into Canada, they're making their way through the port system. And how is it possible that they get through? Is it just that they're not doing enough checks? What more could be done there to stop that? Or is it just like, again, where people are looking in the other direction and they don't really want to do anything about it?
Yeah, that's a question that I ponder a lot, and different people have different answers. But what's established, and I've reported it numerous times, is that in Vancouver, one of the highest volume ports in North America, less than 1% of the containers internationally coming into that port are searched. That's a figure, less than 1%. So that's a huge problem. As I wrote in my book, Willful Blindness, and I've reported repeatedly for the Bureau, also Canada's federal ports police were removed from the Vancouver port and other ports in Canada in the late 1990s. This was against documented warnings from associations of Canadian police, which warned the then Jean Chrétien Liberal government that Chinese triads with connections to Chinese army and intelligence fronts were using Vancouver's port already, along with other criminals, including the Hells Angels, and their exploitation of the Vancouver port especially would grow when the federal police were removed, as of course makes, pure logical sense. And yet those police haven't been replaced. So that gets to the problems. My recent reporting indicates that there are so many complex issues. Other things are that Canada is not just receiving these chemicals and, as I said, producing them in labs for the domestic population and going south of the border. It's also using Vancouver Port to transship the finished narcotics out to New Zealand and Australia, including methamphetamine, ecstasy. All of these materials originally sourced from China, cooked up in Canadian labs, and shipped out. The searches of that finished product going out of the Vancouver Port are even lower than the searches of 1% coming in. One more thing is Canada, I'll throw one more sort of finding into this mix. Canada has a system called bonded warehouses sprinkled across Vancouver where people get sort of a credit that it's like a limited check. So criminals from China and Mexico can ship their product into these bonded warehouses. They are very rarely, if ever, searched by Canada Border Services Agency, and these are used as staging points to receive chemicals coming in and ship finished narcotics going out. So there's probably more problems than that, but that's a pretty good list. And Canada, as Kash Patel told Joe Rogan, this is Vancouver's port in action, used by the Chinese Communist Party and the Mexican cartels.
Do you think that I mean, these networks are so sophisticated, but do you think that that is part of the reason as well for the focus? Because Trump was also very openly focused on the Panama Canal.
It will have a huge impact. To further enhance our national security, my administration will be reclaiming the Panama Canal.
And CK Hutchinson, that company, which is owned by like a Hong Kong billionaire, is there any link there to everything else that's going on?
Absolutely. CK Hutchison Whampoa has been identified in, I believe it was U.S. Senate hearings back in the 1990s about U.S. military concerns that Chinese military fronts connected to that company that you named were exploiting the Panama Canal. So very obviously, they also connected these entities to Chinese mafia, interests, which is the very same node that I sort of exposed in my book, Willful Blindness, and said these very same entities have access to Vancouver's ports. And in modern times, that sort of lineage of the Chinese military connected to Chinese triads, which, as I've said, Canadian police warned the Jean Chrétien government about. I've reported in the Bureau, my website, on documents laying out these concerns that Vancouver would be exploited more if federal police were removed from the ports. And they pointed to that very same entity and the same tycoon from Hong Kong. And so I've done so many stories by now that sort of tie these Chinese investor tycoons with known Chinese intelligence investment front companies, and the same individuals always pop up in sort of political influence scandals in both Washington, Ottawa, Canberra, and elsewhere. I think we'll probably see those same linkages in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, wow. And I mean, I remember just in the past year, there were a bunch of scandals and something to do with possible political influence there from the Chinese Communist Party. Do you think that's a real threat in Canada for Canadian politics, is the Chinese influence? Because these webs are just so sophisticated. They own the lawyers, the ports, the accountants, all these different things.
I think it's a massive problem. And, my reporting for a news company called Global News is still subject of some, legal actions from some of the politicians that were named in allegations from intelligence leaks that I reported on. But I've firmly established through RCMP, that is Canadian police sources, and documents in some cases, that the Chinese, either former security officials or current suspected money laundering barons in Toronto and Vancouver, have direct connections to some of these politicians in Vancouver and Toronto. So I have, for example, received documentation from Canadian police sources. I'll give you an example. I'm pointed to I did some deep reporting on a property on the American border in Chilliwack, British Columbia. My source named a British Columbia politician and called them an Asian organized crime and Chinese Communist Party associate, and noted how they and that property were connected to a number of senior Chinese triad alleged fentanyl trafficking and money laundering figures. So the short answer is, my research strongly indicates Canadian politicians, often from a Chinese background, but not always, are often found in photographs with these very same sort of Chinese money laundering suspects. And in fact, none other than our former Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. My reporting, along with the Globe and Mail, have established that Mr. Trudeau, for some reason, was stumbled into a Canadian surveillance operation where a security team was looking into some very senior alleged Chinese money launderers in Vancouver. And Mr. Trudeau, for some unknown reason, was meeting with them. So I think that's just one example of how my work asserts that Canadian politicians at many levels and across the country are, I say, strategically surrounded with Chinese assets that have organized crime activity involved in their wealth.
Do you think that happens because of just the money in related to it, or do you think it's more of the economics of it all? The fact that all this money laundering coming in, I mean, the real estate market has become such a big component of the economy in Canada. Do you think that that is partly the reason why different politicians will just openly look the other way?
I do think so. I'll stand behind the title of my book, which was Willful Blindness: How a Network of Chinese Narcos, Tycoons, and CCP Agents Infiltrated the West. That was, the book was written in 2021. And if people step back and look at the reporting now coming out of New York Times, ProPublica in the United States, the Daily Caller Foundation, media in Australia, media in Britain, there's a number of stories now coming out that make these direct connections between Chinese organized crime figures, whether they're in Italy, whether they're in New York City, Arcadia down in California, over, in Australia, Sydney. They are, let me put it this way, China's method is repeated in countries around the world, and people involved in Chinese organized crime are tasked to surround and donate to Western politicians. And if they are a good, let's just say a good earning gangster in China and Hong Kong, they can become 10 times more wealthy and powerful if they fulfill the Chinese Communist Party's strategic political tasks. I'll stand beside that, behind that assertion that sort of comes from my book and my ongoing reporting. This is the view of Western intelligence, and I believe it'll become more and more documented in court cases. And this is what's behind the so-called Chinese Communist Party police stations worldwide. It's what's behind a lot of donation scandals, some of them that have surfaced, a lot that haven't yet. To your question, it's a very complex system in which China has, rather the Chinese Communist Party from its start, has strategically integrated and tasked underground criminal networks.
And since the release of your book, and obviously you were reporting on that way before this, but how do you think the problem has evolved? And do you think it's now going into avenues like crypto, avenues like precious metals and things like that? And do you think like even possibly part of the price explosion of some of these things could be directly linked to illicit cash?
The short answer is yes, yes, and yes. Crypto is a huge component of both Chinese state activity, Chinese organized crime activity. I've seen that directly in, for an example, a massive Toronto area illegal casino that has become pretty notorious and known in much mainstream media reporting. But my reporting dug deeper and found that there were Chinese intelligence operations allegedly run out of this mansion of, ill repute, prostitution, gambling, guns, said by police to be funding drugs, and Canadian politicians were frequent visitors. I was told crypto was a big part of the scheme there. Mining. Another recent story I did, there's a person that, this is quite the yarn. There's a person that escaped from a Mexican house arrest because he was due to be extradited to Washington, said to be a global level fentanyl trafficker and money launderer working hand in hand with the Mexican cartels. His name is Brother Juan. He escaped or was let escape Mexican prison, ran off to Cuba. He's now being sent back to, I believe he'll be extradited to Washington, but I found a linkage to Vancouver, and I found a linkage to mining, which you mentioned. He's involved in Mexican mining. He had flown into Vancouver where it looks like a related mining entity was based. Looking at this very broadly, I would say any high, priced asset, commodity, financial system you can think of is very much involved in China's organized crime and state activity. And I know that in U.S. congressional testimony, a former CIA analyst called John Cassara has called this sort of system CCP Inc. and has put sort of the dirty or the integration of legal trade with illegal trade at well over $1 trillion. So it's a massive system.
Wow. Do you think Canadian real estate in particular is just vulnerable to this? Because, it blew my mind the first time I found this out. I read about it in your work as well, but was way before that when I was pricing up a mortgage myself. I couldn't believe that the bank just said, oh yeah, you just need to show where the funds have come from. If they've been in your account for, I think it was 90 days, then that's absolutely fine. you can just put a deposit down and then get a mortgage. Like they won't ask any further questions after that. So do you think things like that, and that may not be actually correct, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but do you think many things like that make Canadian real estate vulnerable? And do you think it's still vulnerable right now to more money laundering?
I do. It's been a while. Looking at Vancouver specifically, I say the proportion of the Vancouver model underground banking flowing into Vancouver real estate is about 30 cents on every dollar. So 30% of the market is this mystery money flowing in from China, which I say whether you're a gangster getting your money from Shenzhen into Vancouver this way, or you're the gangster running the underground banking channel and you're helping a purportedly legitimate school teacher from Beijing get their money. And all in all, it's an organized crime system. And so very early, I had pegged 30% of your home costs should be attributed to Chinese money laundering. But my mind was blown even further when I'll track back to a story I mentioned earlier. A young whistleblower working for HSBC provided me documents from their branch in the Toronto area, which had a very high sort of Chinese diaspora clientele. And people were taking out completely fraudulent mortgages, claiming, again, during the pandemic, to be earning, something like $500,000 from, ex-Beijing fake media company, as a side job during remote working opportunities for the pandemic. Grade A Canadian banks were giving these loans at scale. So this is why I say I noted in my reporting in 2023 that an academic named Andy Yan had already established, I think back in 2016, that there was very strange patterns in mortgages, mostly going to sort of mainland China named individuals that had come to dominate whole neighborhoods of home buying patterns in Vancouver. And so I say it's a long history of banks going along for the ride in Canada. Are Canadian homeowners vulnerable to this? Yeah, I say hugely vulnerable, especially in Vancouver and Toronto. But a lot have also been sucked into that system of sort of fudging, or the banks sort of letting people take on mortgages that there's no way in a real economic analysis they could ever afford.
And is it the banks that are looking the other way when they see these suspicious transactions, or is it FinTrack that's, they're flagging these transactions, but then they do nothing with it after the fact? Where is most of this happening? Is it on the government side, or is it on like the banking side?
I think this is a story that sort of goes across Canadian business and government. But in my experience, FinTrack, I've talked to actual investigators up to senior levels. And in my experience, all or almost all of them are great investigators and great Canadians that if they were empowered to do the type of work that the US government had to do, down in New York and New Jersey on the TD Bank case, they would do that. They would have done that in Toronto. They would have cracked down on these fake Chinese mortgages schemes that I've just talked about. But they're not empowered. And that goes up to the Ministry of Finance, which is a powerful ministry, the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's office. And so whether that's Mark Carney, a global banker now, he would probably have a lot more understanding than Justin Trudeau and his office did, of Canada's complicity or exposure to this criminal lending scheme. And I have to believe that there've probably been some pretty, if not directly between Scott Bessent at Treasury and Mark Carney and his finance minister, I'm sure the message is getting conveyed from Treasury to Carney that Canada needs to not just crack down on fentanyl super labs, but crack down on these financial systems and law firms, by the way, that are abetting this massive money laundering.
And are they all linked to it? Like they know that this is going on, like the law firms, the accountants, all these people who are caught in the middle, essentially, of the economics, the real estate agents. Do you think they all know on a level? And is this why, like in places like Vancouver, the top performing real estate agents, for example, are often Chinese?
100%. That's what I learned over 10 years ago in Vancouver. A person with no experience in Canada's market would arrive from Hong Kong, and within a year or two, they would be the top realtor in town or the top 1%. And it's not just because all of the money was coming from China. I believe at the highest levels, those top level realtors are sort of handpicked as trusted figures for major business from both Chinese organized crime figures and Chinese state figures who shovel money their way because they can be trusted to accept it, without talking to Canadian police. Again, leaning back on the TD Bank Department of Justice agreement, TD has agreed that its executives ignored certain risk programs. And so that's why the bank has been said to be, involved in money laundering. You ask, is everyone sort of aware or in on it? I think it's my opinion that law firms, certain ones, are 100% not only in on this, but are helping to architect this. And the same can be said of bankers, accountants, and people in politics too, I do believe.
And when you zoom out a bit from North America and you go to like Europe, for example, or Asia, you just do not see the types of scenes that you see in places like Vancouver, places like San Francisco, where you've got like this massive fentanyl use, this massive open drug use. And why do you think that is? Like, why do you think it's so confined to North America? And do you think that part of the reason behind that is in fact Canada itself facilitating it?
Yeah. One, Canada is seen to be facilitating this and overrun by Chinese state operations and Chinese organized crime. A former Canadian intelligence analyst and historian just put out a book called Under Assault, which I've been reporting on or reviewing the book, where this writer named Dennis Molinaro says that he talked to US government officials that said Canada is overrun to the point that it's trying to stay afloat due to so much Chinese state infiltration. And I say that's directly connected to the organized crime we're talking about. So yes, I do think Canada is being used as a tool in China's financial and narcotics operations and its political operations. And the US House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party's influence, a powerful sort of bipartisan body in Washington of lawmakers, in fact, came out with a study last year that says senior Chinese Communist Party officials are involved in fentanyl production companies, and Beijing, in fact, subsidizes the fentanyl precursor trade. They'll give you a value-added tax in China if you're a factory that sends precursor chemicals outside of China. So here's the key. It appears from what I hear from, intelligence officials that China strategically does send fentanyl and fentanyl precursors to areas where it wants to market the drug. And it wants to market the drug to harm North America, which is what, again, Kash Patel told Joe Rogan, and people laughed at that.
Going to keep bringing this stuff into the country, the northern border. And they're sailing around to Vancouver and coming in by air.
But I say that's sound logic, and Kash Patel probably has a report behind him to back up that statement. There are a lot of complex, financial actors involved in what China's doing. We could talk for days about how their Belt and Road sort of global development and trade system, I'm told by US DEA sources, knowingly actors in that use pools of drug cash from the Vancouver model to develop those projects worldwide. We now hear reports of, methamphetamine flooding into the South Pacific countries where China wants to gain, sort of increased power. I do think it's strategic, and it's part of a warlike strategy. I do think so.
And how much of all this actually plays into Canada's economy? Like, because it's kind of hard to even imagine it, but how much of like GDP, for example, as a ballpark would this represent? Because obviously if it's real estate and it's all these different things like mining, which Canada is also so happens to be a center of for mining companies and resource companies as well. Is there any reporting on that that's been done, or any estimates of to how much the economy is actually relying on illicit cash and drug money?
I think the most often quoted Canadian criminal intelligence study has put an annual estimate, and this was from years ago, at something like 120 billion was sort of a relatively modest estimate of how much money laundering is in Canada's GDP per year. Mm-hmm. But you mentioned mining, resources. I've talked about real estate development and, supercars. Probably if we could get into fisheries, sawmills, these are all as my sources indicate, massive pools for Chinese capital flight. Chinese capital flight being the same, liquidity involved in these Vancouver model transactions. And so again, I think I confidently estimated, trying to remember my math, but in 2014, 1.2 billion in cash was laundered through BC government casinos. This comes from the Cullen Commission into Anti-Money Laundering, which was stood up to examine my sort of news reporting and confirmed massive scale through BC casinos. So all of the people involved in that Chinese money laundering, the records that I, examined said most or all were involved in Vancouver real estate as well. So if you take, $1 billion in drug cash through the casinos in 1 year, and you say, okay, everyone involved, they probably into homes. Let's put a 10 times number on $1 billion and say that's a good estimate of what they're laundering into the bigger pool of real estate. So 10 billion a year in Vancouver real estate, Chinese money laundering, I found to be a very, very modest and low end estimate. I think it's much higher than that, easily higher than 20 billion per year in Vancouver. And Toronto could be equal or more. And remember, I said, again, all the data points I put together, including talking to mortgage industry sources, key financial analysts, calculated about $1 trillion of this same sort of activity in Vancouver and Toronto over a 10-year period. So when you multiply that out through farmland, factories, mining, I think the scale just gets enormous.
Wow. That is crazy. And do you think that obviously there's a reluctance in Canada to prosecute these people, to go after these people? Because when I was reading in your book, and when many other people were probably reading your book as well, they're probably just mind blown at how these people are known to be operating and are seemingly getting away from it. And even when they're brought in and hauled into jail and to courts and stuff, they seemingly just manage to get away with it on some little technicality.
Absolutely. And, I was asked to testify in Canada's Parliament in recent months based on my reporting of sort of what I have reported on Canada's border vulnerabilities. And I reported that almost every major organized crime or money laundering case involving Chinese organized crime and Mexican cartels, and there have been numerous that have been forwarded in Alberta, British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec in, let's say, the past 5 years or so. Almost every case has collapsed at trial, and it's because Canada's legal system has major loopholes that essentially, if I can describe it a bit, demand that police turn over every shred of evidence to the defense side beyond any reasonable sort of demands. And it leads to sort of time delays and information disclosure mistakes, both of which are cited as reasons for many of these major cases I'm talking about, including ones very central to my findings in the Vancouver model.
This video was powered by ExpressVPN, helping you protect your privacy with the world's fastest VPN and the VPN that I use. If you want to take advantage of my special offer, go to expressvpn.com/marketmania. Let's get back to it.
Including ones very central to my findings in the Vancouver model, falling apart before these major Mexican and Chinese organized crime figures can even stand up in court to face the trials.
What do you think the biggest threat is for Western countries like Canada and the United States in the next 5 years as it relates to money laundering, these kingpins that are known to be operating in Vancouver and other places?
I've been told directly, and my work would support it, I've been told by senior U.S. drug enforcement officials that the biggest threat, bar none, to Canada is its open borders to the synthetic narcotics from Chinese and Mexican cartels, and how this is flooding into and out of Canada. It's destabilizing the country. The opioid overdose death toll is very well known. I believe tens of thousands now in Canada, hundreds of thousands in the United States. And Canada is very clearly a major weak link in sort of Western law enforcement. And so when you ask what's the biggest threat to Canada and the United States, In a sense, well, China is the biggest threat. Mexico is working with China. And to too large an extent, Canada has been interrelated with those threat networks. I think that's the biggest threat to Canada's sovereignty, along with the straight up, death totals of narcotics washing into our country and the violent crime that relates to it. As I said, that also leads to, I think, a political and social destabilization problem. And I think it's a sovereign threat.
And just to quickly add to that one last thing, I've wondered, like, do you think this is an actually easy thing to stop, or do you think like it's an easy thing, it's just nobody wants to do it, or do you think it's much more complex? Like, do you think it would be at the port level, or where do you think you could actually shut this down pretty quickly if you wanted to? It's just nobody wants to.
It would definitely be massively difficult, but it's doable if you have the political will and the social will, meaning the citizens of Canada understand the problems and tell their politicians and law enforcement they need solutions. So to me, when I think about your great question, can Canada get out of this? I think about Mexico, a country that is already much deeper into the same problems. Can Mexico be pulled out? Look, the American government is offering to send military in. I think if you take a military and law enforcement solution to these embedded organized crime and let's just say, hostile state networks, you can tackle them. But as you've sort of indicated, there's going to be an economic impact. I say in Canada, on our real estate prices, we're going to have to weed out our economy or maybe drain out the swamp of it is a better, metaphor. And there will be casualties, but absolutely Canada can turn the corner. Solutions, you need to put some federal port police back in the ports. You need to toughen up Canada's laws. And as I say in my book, Willful Blindness, we don't even have an anti-racketeering law, which doesn't make any sense. So of course, this is why the worst of global organized crime and state actors come to Canada to act. We still lack, even though my work led to Canadian parliamentarians voting on a Foreign Agent Transparency Registration Act or tool, over a year later, Mark Carney's government hasn't even implemented the tool, which just gets back to your question, is this about, legal problems, or is it politicians that are turning a blind eye? I think both.
Check out Sam Cooper's book, which is Willful Blindness. Absolutely mind-blowing read. Honestly, sometimes when you're reading it, it seems like you're reading fiction, but it's actually real, which is the crazy thing.
Can I add one observation to what you just said? When you said the book reads like fiction, often I sometimes wake up at night and I have these same thoughts. Every month that I put into driving my investigations further, I'll give you an example. I just reported on a story that was broken by my colleague Philip Lunzicki at the Daily Caller in the United States. He pointed to a well-known case in Vancouver involving all kinds of nefarious Chinese activity, a man beaten outside a home. And then what do you know? People involved in that allegedly own property beside the United States B-2 stealth bomber base that sent the bombs into Iran's nuclear facilities. So I believe it's all part of that web where you see organized crime activity, property ownership, drug activity. And as we now know in the US, they're putting these assets besides critical infrastructure. So you could not make this up in Hollywood, but I say it's accelerating.
Yeah, there should be a movie that's done. You should reach out to MGM.
Yeah, I'll leave the phone on. I'm waiting for that call.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Sam. Check out Sam Cooper's book, Willful Blindness. Absolutely fantastic read. And check out all the work that he does at the Bureau. I'll see you in the next one.